I think it only fitting to open a discussion about Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man with a particular verse from the Bible. Since Christopher Rocchio himself is religious and a Catholic, I think you can see a lot of those themes start to bleed through in The Sun Eater, and I think you can definitely start to see it come through in the back half of the series. And I wanted to read this verse. It's a short verse from the book of James, the letter of James, chapter 1 and verse 2. This is what's written. It says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." And then it goes on from there. I find this verse particularly interesting because why should trials, or in this case suffering, be something that somebody counts as joy? I'm sure somebody who is never religious might find that concept confusing, and truthfully, I think even people who do grow up religious in some kind of religion or another, who maybe even their doctrine teaches this belief, they may even struggle with that and find it confusing as well because it's a hard concept to grasp. And I think that it is this concept that Christopher Rocchio is specifically exploring, and that's why Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man are so important to the series. Hey guys, welcome back to 115 Reading. My name is Ethan, and I just finished reading Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man. This is technically books 4 and 5 of The Sun Eater, but as most people know, book 4, Kingdoms of Death, was split during the pandemic because of the paper shortage, and so Kingdoms of Death became Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man. And as such, I'm going to be reviewing the two basically as one book because that is how I read it the first time I went through the series, and that is how I'm going to read it again. And I think any issues like pacing or otherwise kind of resolve themselves when you read them together as one long volume. And I think the book is better for it. So I'm going to be, if I refer to it as the book, I'm probably, that's just me because in my head, these two are still one, and that's how I'm treating it as such. So the reread is almost over. The road to Gododin is almost here, and I think we have approached one of the most important parts of the series, and that is the book where Hadrian suffers the most and where Hadrian loses everything. It is in stark contrast to Demon in White, where Hadrian is constantly at the top of his game in that book, where he is almost always right and almost always winning and almost always doing cool stuff. It is the complete polar opposite of Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man. Hadrian is constantly losing. Hadrian is constantly suffering. Hadrian loses every single person important to him in this book, and that is the point. Because as we're going to get into as we get to, basically to Disquiet Gods especially, we're going to learn why this part of Hadrian's story is important and why the phrase "seek hardship" is so important to the themes and story of this series. Because Hadrian, he didn't seek it. He goes through a lot of hardship in this book, and that can't be denied. And I want to basically just discuss how this book affected me more on the reread, especially with the knowledge of things that happen in Disquiet Gods. And I'm going to use a little bit of Disquiet Gods to hopefully explain why I think this book is so important and what it's doing in the overall series. So if you watch my video on Demon in White, you'll know that going back in the reread, I was trying to determine kind of the arc and what is being explored in each book, especially Demon in White. And something I came away with on my reread of Demon in White is that at the end of Howling Dark, Hadrian knows what he is fighting against, which is the Cielsen. And he knows in the abstract that he's fighting for humanity. But when you get to Demon in White, a Demon in White is where Hadrian learns that he has to fight for something. He can't just fight against something. So this is where he decides to fight for humanity, but that's only in the abstract sense. He really learns that he wants to fight for basically his friends, for Polino, Alara, Siren, Krim, and for Valka and Gibson. Those are the people that form his true motivation for fighting this Yeltsin, because he is trying to protect his friends and his found family. And this book is important because now Hadrian's family is taken away by the end of this. Every single character that Hadrian has come close to, besides one, has been killed by the end of this book. And now the question going forward into Disquiet Gods is going to be, okay, you were fighting for your family. What are you going to fight for when even those are taken away? And something that really reframed how I read this was when I posted my review of Demon in White in the Red Company Discord. I think it was Longson now Rubius pointed an additional layer to this out to me, because what he pointed out was that very explicitly Hadrian is working through the 8 forms of obedience as the series goes on, and that totally gave such a much easier way to explain what I was trying to explore in the Demon in White video. That Hadrian is is basically throughout these books is learning, is going through the different forms of obedience, is going from the basis form of obedience out of fear of pain, and by the end of the series is going to be serving out of love. And that is why this series is so important, because what this book shows and what Disquiet Gods is going to reveal to us is that one cannot serve out of love, one cannot obey out of love if one does not suffer pain. And that's why this book is so important for the overall series, because this is the book where Hadrian suffers everything and suffers the most pain. And when you get to the end of it, it can be kind of hard because, especially on your first time reading through it, at least the first time I read through it, it was hard to understand why it was necessary, other than the abstract sense of, oh, it's good for our heroes to lose, right? Everybody always talks about how they want their heroes to lose in their stories. But I think the losing and the pain and the suffering, once you've read Disquiet Gods, and I'm certain once we've all read Shadows Upon Time next month, basically this book was transformed in my head, and I realized why it is the linchpin that makes Disquiet Gods work. Because everybody raves about Disquiet Gods, but Disquiet Gods would not work, it would not be emotionally impactful without the suffering in Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man. Because I would like to read this section from Disquiet Gods, because when we get to the end, and spoilers for Disquiet Gods, if anybody's here, this whole series of videos has been a serious spoiler discussion. So if you haven't read all these, I don't know what you're doing here. But in the chapter 40 of Disquiet Gods, we learn this: as Hadrian is presented with his test and with his choice to slay the Quiet, he falters at the last second and realizes why his suffering was important, because he realizes that the Quiet suffers, and he's trying to figure out why the Quiet is willing to suffer for humanity that also suffers. Why does he let suffering happen? All of these things. And there's this great quote where he's thinking about the Quiet, and he says, "I felt his sorrow, deeper than human feeling and yet not strange, like a familiar color, somehow darker than the human eye could perceive. Always we were turning from the path, turning against him. He felt our every pain, witnessed our every torment, experienced every injury as though it were his own. Still, he would not stop us, for to stop us would be to destroy the very thing that made us what we are. And feeling that pain, I understood the why at last. He suffered to see our suffering, and so our suffering made us more like him, who knew our every hurt." So at this point, if you haven't pieced it together, when you get to chapter 40 of Disquiet Gods, I think Christopher Rocchio's religious background and his Catholic faith are really showing themselves here. And he's tackling a question, I think, as old as time when it comes to the relationship that man has with God, or whatever they follow in religion. And that is, why it is suffering, why do bad things happen on earth? And I love how most times when this question is tackled, it always comes back to the whole debate between free will, right? Well, if a divine being, God, comes in and stops everything bad from happening, then he's stripping away free will from humanity. And a lot of times the argument stops there. And I like how even this is brought up in the chapter 40 of Disquiet Gods. And Hadrian is told, oh, well, it would be tyrannical for him to strip away your ability to choose. And Hadrian rightfully points out, but what did I choose? I I was just a pawn in the Quiet's game. I suffered all these things, and I lost everything. And the answer that comes down to is that suffering makes us more like him. It helps us understand him more, because he suffered so that we could suffer. And then taking that further, I can't remember where it is in Disquiet Gods as well, but I think it's somewhere near the end of the book where Hadrian has this really great quote, and I tried to look for it before this review, but I couldn't find it. I know about it because I quoted it in my Goodreads review last year, where Hadrian says something that pain is the foundation of our civilization, and every moment of progression that we make, every law that we pass, everything that we build is we do it so that we can minimize the pain of others. And that when we suffer, not only are we more like him, in this case, the Quiet, but we suffer because we can take that suffering and use it to ease the suffering of others. It's when we have suffered ourselves that we are given the tools and the empathy needed to try and ease the pain and the suffering of others. And I found that a beautiful exploration and a beautiful answer to this question. Why does suffering happen? It happens so that we can take that and ease the suffering of others, because we have been through it, and we don't want others to go through what we have gone through. And so we will suffer ourselves to ease the sufferings of others. And when we suffer ourselves to ease the sufferings of others, we are becoming like him. In this case, we're becoming like the quiet. In Rakio's case, he's becoming like God, and or not becoming like God, but understanding God, if that makes sense. And so it is through this suffering that we can understand him, and that we can be like him, because like him, we are trying to ease the sufferings of others. And it is because of that that even though we are suffering, we can serve and we can obey out of love, because we are loving the people around us and we're trying to ease their suffering. And that is why I think that these two books are important for the last two books in the series, because Hadrian has to go through this suffering to be able to swear an oath and follow the quiet out of a sense of love instead of any of the other forms of obedience. And it's also what is going to turn Hadrian not from a vengeful character, but from a hopeful character. And that's something that stood out to me on Disquiet Gods when I read it. And I know that I'm talking more about Disquiet Gods than these two, but I'm trying to explain why Disquiet Gods hit so much because of these. But a lot of people, when they finish Kings of Death and Ashes of Man, when you read the reviews or when you watch the videos, people will talk about how these books were necessary because we need to understand why Hadrian is willing to destroy the Cielcen. And so because the Cilcian destroy everything that he loves, of course, now Hadrian has the motivation to exact his vengeance on them. But Disquiet Gods reframes this, because after Kings of Death and Ashes of Man, you may be led to believe that that is what the story is going to be. Hadrian exacting his vengeance, and how cathartic it will be for him to destroy the people that destroyed his people. But no, even though that's what you're led to believe at the end of this book on your first reread, on the reread, you understand that what's really happening is that Hadrian is suffering, and he's going to take that suffering and use it as a tool of love to ease the sufferings of others by eventually, destroying the Watchers and their servants, the Cielcen, who are trying to bring the most suffering down on humanity and all those around it. And so I think we're reframing the discussion here that what Hadrian is revealing to us is that his act of destroying the sun, while it did slay many people, it was ultimately an act of love, because the Cielcen and the Watchers, their goal is to bring so much suffering. And because of the suffering Hadrian goes through here, he does not want that to happen. And so he will devote himself to the quiet out of love, and he is devoting himself to humanity, and he is easing humanity's suffering as much as possible by destroying the Sun Eater. So this is not a tale of somebody who loses everything and commits a giant act of vengeance. This is a tale of somebody who loses everything and wants to prevent that from happening to anybody else. And I think that's an interesting tack to take, while at the same time exploring themes of religion and devotion and love and suffering. And I just find that really fascinating and really impactful. And I don't think that that angle will reveal itself to you until you're rereading these, after you've read Disquiet Gods and Shadows Upon Time. What we're getting here is an exploration of one of the oldest questions in humans' history, and that is the question of suffering. And that question becomes a lot more hard to grapple with if you are also bringing in a divine being into the equation. If there is a divine being, how does that change how we view suffering? And why does it seem like, in a lot of religious teachings, it says that suffering is a good thing? Because that doesn't seem like it should make sense. And I like the answer that is explored in this series. It may not work for you. You may feel unsatisfied by that, but I feel like I came away understanding Rakio and how he feels about things. And why would you read other than to experience somebody else's viewpoint on something, and to see how he explores this question, and help me understand, parts of teachings of the Bible that I've grappled with and never understood before myself. And so I think that's fascinating. And I know it's going to be a huge turnoff for people. I think that this series does dip into such questions and themes of religion and God and, biblical imagery and teachings. And maybe that'll be a turnoff for you in this sci-fi series. But for me, it's what makes the Sun Eater unique. It's what makes it emotionally impactful. And so it makes it so interesting. And you don't get any of that stuff if you don't have the suffering in Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man. And that's why these two, while they may not be my favorite of the series, why they're so important and why they're so emotionally impactful.